My topic was climate change and climate change policies, especially the steps leading up to the establishment of those policies. So the outline of how I did my research was the effects of climate change, the impacts on human populations, what the policies are, and then within policies, what is the dispersal of responsibility among the various nations, and goals and improvements that various people have proposed for existing plans. So as far as the effects of climate change, there are a lot of them, and there's a lot of research on a lot of them. So I tried to stick to a few that I understood the best and that I knew would have a lot of effects on human populations, either directly or indirectly. One study about the decline in biodiversity was based in California, where there is over 5,500 native species, 40% of which are endemic, so their populations are only in this region of California. They did their study on 591 species because those species had the most data on them, and they ran simulations where these species could not move, but they could shrink their area, or they were able to move. In these different simulations, they ran varying degrees of climate change. So, like the worst possible scenario that is being projected right now to the not to the less bad scenarios, and they didn't unfortunately provide details as to what those situations entailed. Um, at current rates, the peak diversity in California is 340 species per kilometer squared. But at the highest level of climate change that they studied, that number dropped to 247 species per kilometer squared. Under the low climate change allowed to move scenarios, they saw a trend of increased biodiversity in large open areas, particularly in the northeast coast, and that moving towards the northeast coast was a trend they noticed in all of their simulations, but particularly this particular scenario. An effect that kind of goes hand in hand with the declines in biodiversity is environmental shifts of varying types. One of which is life events of different species, such as mating, blooming, that kind of thing. They can occur at different times than what is historically normal for those species based on the effects of climate change. For example, warmer spring temperatures in the late 20th century resulted in swallows mating earlier. These species can also change the ranges that they inhabit. So if animals need to move out of whatever range they're naturally in, but are unable to find suitable habitat, or there's too many of a species for that suitable habitat, it can very quickly lead to extinction events or just massive die-offs of a species, particularly with amphibians, since they need wetlands. And if their wetlands dry up and there's not another one for them to move to, they don't have anywhere to go. Unfortunately, there are not really strategies for resource managers to allow for these changes. So people working in national parks or working to conserve species don't really, like, they're aware of these problems, but they don't have the ability to really do anything about it. And they don't know what to do or how to really change their management strategies for their area with these changes. Another large effect is rainfall and weather patterns in general. One study showed that surface air temperatures have risen at double the rate of temperatures over the ocean. And there's also been changing precipitation rates, which have led to longer, more intense drought periods, particularly in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. They've been hit by a lot of extreme drought and very heavy rains when they do get rain. So because of this, it strips the top layer of soil so they can't really grow as much food, and it also prevents, because the rain comes down so heavy and so frequent, so fast, their groundwater doesn't replenish as well as it should, which further exacerbates the drought later. One study found that the annual mean warming in Africa is expected to be 1.5 times greater than the rest of the world, just because of where it's located on the equator. And along with that, with the rain patterns, current models show that cyclone intensity is expected to increase by 2 to 11% and frequency to increase by 6 to 3.4%. So regions in areas that are likely to get hit by cyclones are at high risk of damage from that, whether it be structural or their farmland or something like that. As far as impacts on populations, developing nations has been found suffer about 99% of climate change casualties. A lot of that is just based on their resources and what they can, like healthcare, money to counter climate change. In, in those developing nations, 60% of their workforce is agriculturally based. So, like I mentioned earlier, with the droughts and heavy rain, if when their topsoil gets damaged or washed away by the rain, they don't really have the money or the resources to fix it. So that leads to food shortages and poverty because they can't grow enough to feed themselves, let alone to sell. So this leads to them being food insecure as well. So that just increases their vulnerability to even more violent changes in the weather patterns that are being projected, as opposed to what we're already seeing. Coastal regions have been found to be at particularly high risk due to rising sea level. One projection showed that, oh my God, if the Greenland ice sheet were to melt, there would be a 6-meter sea level rise, but if the Antarctic ice sheet were to melt, it'd be a 60-meter sea level rise. One archipelago, the Cazenovia Islands, ended up having 2 of the islands. They were their coasts were completely washed away in 1995, and one island was cut in half. And then in 2005, Papua New Guinea decided to just relocate all of the residents to a different island, and that was resources that the Papua New Guinea government had to give to them because the islanders didn't have those resources. And it also led to their groundwater being damaged, being salinated, so they weren't able to grow crops. And then just moving them to a different island would just mean likely that they would just have to deal with those problems still, just later. So as far as policies, a lot of policy debate has to do with public opinion as far as passing legislature. And it has been found that climate change has a very cyclic life in the news, so it'll be very prominent, it'll fade out, and then no one will talk about it. A 2016 study showed that the percentage of scientists quoted by the media through the decade climate change issues has decreased, and they were really being wedged out by political sources, especially in the 80s. And since this is largely due to the public being key to passing legislature. So if politicians want to pass a certain piece of legislation, they're going to really hammer on it to get the public to pay attention, but then the scientists that are giving them the information aren't really getting the same amount of screen time. Another study found that political ideations do impact how frequently people click on and read articles about climate change, no matter what kind of lens the article is through, whether it be health or economics or whatever, or what have you. It was found that while audiences tended to be more likely to read those articles if they were about public health, that was still mostly among liberal Democrats, and the conservative Republicans in general spent 7.21 less seconds reading the articles. So it kind of impacts how much they know, what they're reading about it, and just in general their knowledge of climate change. And it has been found that Americans are generally misinformed about climate change. So a lot of it has to do with politics of speaking about climate change, like who's speaking and who's reading it in what context. So the plans for the future that I've seen that I saw most during my research that had the most to them, other than just people being like, hey, we should do this without really talking about it. One of them that I thought was really interesting was involving climate change in trade agreements between nations. So this means that the nations would establish what their goals are, or like as far as building things, or like not using fossil fuels as much. So if one country violated whatever terms they set up, they would be subject to the same punishment as they would if they violated the trade agreement itself. So that kind of makes them more likely to follow through with the agreement, because a lot of the argument against about what went wrong with the Kyoto Protocol is that it was a lot of voluntarily based, like the nations were deciding their own goals and they were reporting on themselves. But if it's multiple nations having to work together for these trade agreements and then adding climate change into that, they're more likely to follow through with their goals so that they don't get punished or taxed or what have you. Another key thing that is being much more implemented is making the responsibility for cleanup equal to the responsibility for the damage. There was at one point belief that since developing nations are outputting so much more fossil fuels than they should have to deal with the damage more. But it's actually, the truth of the matter is that they're just trying to catch up to industrialized nations to be as developed as they are. So it's a matter of the industrialized nations have been putting out the fossil fuels longer and much more intensely. And even though it is speeding up in developing nations, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are the ones that need to clean it up. So while there is a lot of information about climate change, it is important that everyone is understanding of that information. And and if that is accomplished, legislation and what have you, and guidelines and changes in climate change policy can better be made, but it needs to be established what that change actually needs to be. Are there any questions?